Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to welcome you to our Mind Your Career webinar entitled Chicago Booth Civic Scholars Program. Many of us think about the need for an MBA to advance our careers in finance, banking, or other corporations. But is this the right move for those working in nonprofit organizations or the public sector? Chicago Booth thinks so and encourages its new scholarship program. Funded by the Neubauer Family Foundation, the Civics Scholars Program at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business offers eight full tuition scholarships each year to the weekend MBA program for exceptional professionals who work for nonprofit organizations or the government. Neubauer Civic Scholars will also have the specialized programming and mentoring. This is a great opportunity for nonprofit and government professionals to earn their MBA from a top-tier school while continuing to work in their organizations. Molly O'Donnell is the director of the Booth School of Business Civic Scholars Program. Molly brings to us 20 years of experience working across academic, government, private, and nonprofit sectors. Now let me welcome and hand over the controls to Molly. Please remember to type in your questions in the questions panel on your right.
Great, thank you. I'm really excited to be able to talk about the Civic Scholars Program today with everyone. It's a new program, relatively new program, and so we're still trying to get the word out about it. I should say, if I sound like I'm a little froggy, I've been on about 8 flights in the last week, so I'm not surprised if I'm starting to catch something. So anyway, this is a really exciting time at Booth, I think, for the kind of incorporation and research and thinking more about the nonprofit and public sectors. So the social enterprise initiatives that many of you might know about has been around since 2012, and at SEI they work with professors on research in the nonprofit sector, and they will work with students who might want to think about starting a nonprofit, and then they also work with a lot of our alums who are interested in being on the boards of nonprofits. So there's been this background for the last few years of just paying more attention and putting more effort into these sectors. So the Civic Scholars Program was just started a year ago, January. We're just a little over a year old. And as Lucy said, funded by the Neubauer Family Foundation. I get questions a lot about, like, people are suspicious sometimes about Chicago Booth doing something with the nonprofit sector. And they always ask me, like, why are you all doing this? And it's really the fundamental concept is that Mr. Neubauer, through working with the Family Foundation, had been working with nonprofits for many years and basically saw that there were some of the organizations that they were working with who could use enhanced skills in some of these kind of business skill areas. And many of us who have spent our lives in nonprofit and government realize that at times the pay scale isn't quite the same as in the private sector. And so it's really quite a barrier for many people in these sectors to be able to pay back the loans that you would need to take to get an MBA at Booth. And I think one of the things we think about is that if you are in the private sector and you get an MBA, the likelihood that your salary is going to increase and probably increase significantly is a little more assured. If you're in the nonprofit sector, getting an MBA doesn't necessarily mean that your salary is going to be significantly higher in the next 5 or 10 years. So Mr. Neubauer just simply decided to eliminate that barrier. And so we're going to do, this first year, we're doing 8 scholarships. We plan on doing around 8 each year. That isn't a set in stone number. we are not likely to start doing more scholarships. We may do 6 some years, maybe 8. So we're going to kind of see how it goes. But our very first group of Civic Scholars has just started courses this year, so they started in September. So it's nice to be in a position where we get to build this program and see what actually works for them as they are, going through a couple of quarters to see the reality of what their needs are that may be slightly different from sort of a typical MBA student, and also the reality of the kind of time they have outside of everything else that's going on at Booth to dedicate to some specialized programming. So like I said, the impetus was pretty straightforward. One of the things about this, our first round of applications, it was announced January 2016 that the program even existed. And then they decided to go ahead and immediately start recruiting for the first class instead of waiting a year. So the first round of applications, it only was open from January to May. We had some great response, and we had a really great pool of applicants. But I don't know that we can, really say much about what what is typical about the process or the applicants, given that that was a bit of an anomaly as far as timing and such. So now that we have had the last year to be recruiting for our next class, I think that this next class that will be chosen to start in September 2017 may, sort of the applicants pool and those sorts of things may start to look a little bit more like what we expect will happen going forward. So the basic requirements for the program, to apply for the program, are that you have to currently be working in a nonprofit organization or the government, and then while you're doing your MBA, you have to stay in one of those sectors and for 3 years afterwards. So the scholarship is actually structured as a forgivable loan, which means that the first year after you've completed your MBA, a certain percentage is forgiven, then the second year, and then after the third year, it's all forgiven. So we incentivize people to stay in the sectors after they've completed their MBAs. So I think the big questions that we tend to get from people who haven't really thought about an MBA for these sectors is like, does this really apply? Nonprofits aren't businesses. So there's kind of a few typical phrases like that we tend to hear when people aren't really sure about this. But the reality is strategic planning, whether you're in the nonprofit sector or the private sector, is an important skill to have. Critical analysis is an important skill to have. Financial accounting, important skill to have. So, the majority of what you learn in an MBA is, pretty straightforward, applicable in the nonprofit sector. Some things maybe aren't quite as straightforward, and that's what is one of the benefits of being part of the Civic Scholars Program, is that you have 8 or in future years a few more colleagues that are with you going through the program who can help kind of think about and translate some of the aspects of what's happening in the coursework of the MBA into their organizations. So the idea that there are 8 of you together kind of thinking through what you're learning and how it's being applied in your different organizations, and what is it doing, what is it meaning for your organizations and for yourself as far as your own career. So I think that there's having the scholarship is obviously a key component of this, but that second part of the extracurricular work that we're doing and having a cohort of people who are working through some of the same issues is a really important component of this as well. I'm going to, sorry, I switched out PowerPoints earlier today, so I'm gonna let's make sure this is actually, did you all see that move? Make sure it's happening.
Yes, we saw it.
Great. One of the things that is sometimes a little bit confusing to folks about the this particular Civic Scholars Program is that it is not, the MBA itself is not any different than everybody else. So it's the same MBA. There's no required courses. There's no specific sequence or anything like that. And our weekend MBA program actually has students from all across the country. So the majority of our students in the weekend MBA program come from outside of Illinois. And that's why we very intentionally have housed the Civic Scholars Program in the weekend MBA. We wanted to make sure that this opportunity was open to people from across the country. And in the same way that you know, the regular weekend MBA students coming in from different places across the country are bringing with them different perspectives. The same is true for the Civic Scholars. So it kind of sounds insane, but there are a lot of people that, you know, in Washington, D.C. or New York City get on a flight at 6 a.m. every Saturday morning and come to Booth, fly to Chicago, take classes on Saturday, and then fly back home. So we are really hoping that in the same way that we can attract students from across the country for, you know, the regular MBA, we're hoping that we can attract students from across the country to think about the Civic Scholars Program. The reality of paying for that travel is, we understand, is still difficult. So the Civic Scholars Program does not pay for travel if you are coming in from outside, but we do pay the full cost of the tuition. So people have, in our, like for instance, in our first group of 8, one of our Civic Scholars is from Seattle, and so the organization she works for a global health organization. They just simply allow her some flexibility to leave a little early on Friday from work, or if she needs to work remotely for part of the day, she can do that. And so there's ways to make it work. She does take a lot of red-eye flights Friday night to Saturday morning between Seattle and Chicago. But, you know, the Civic Scholars seem to be making that work as far as travel and getting all of that organized within their lives, just as well as our other weekend MBA students. So these are actual Booth students. This is from a marketing piece that we did at the beginning of the program before we actually had Civic Scholars that we had photos of. So these are Booth students, but they are not Civic Scholars. So like I said, we're housed in the weekend MBA program. When it comes to things like, you know, you have to be working in a nonprofit or government, there's no requirement about how big the nonprofit is, what kind of nonprofit it is, what parts of the government you work in. So of our 8 current Civic Scholars, there are people who work in, like I mentioned, Sharanya, who is in Seattle. She works at a big global health organization. But there's also somebody, Kelly, who started her own early childhood center on the south side of Chicago, and is, you know, in the beginning stages of her organization. She has a small staff, and they're focused on a really local area. So, you know, there's no, you know, we don't assume that you're going to work at the Red Cross or a giant nonprofit. You can be sort of anywhere within that realm. You have to be some form of 501c. Doesn't necessarily have to be a 501c3. So and that is, for those of you that aren't familiar with the tax codes on that. So nonprofit organizations by the IRS are categorized as 501c organizations. 501c3 is what we typically think about for like charity organizations. But there are actually nearly 24 different C categories. So 501c3, those are the organizations that if you make a donation to them, you get a tax write-off. But if it's a C4, C5, C6, C7, C8, C12, C13, you know, all of those other variations, although they have nonprofit status, you yourself don't get a tax write-off if you make a donation to them. So, you know, this is one of those kind of technicalities that at the beginning of the program we hadn't really thought a lot about, but it, you know, it has come up, and so we very much decided that we wanted the scholarship to be as available and as open as possible. So it doesn't matter which kind of C organization you belong to, as long as you you work in a 501c of some sort. And same thing with the government. You could be part of the local government, the state government, the national government. It doesn't matter to us. So if you you might work at the city of Chicago, or you might work at the U.S. State Department. So again, it's anything within that realm of government. Here are two of our actual civic scholars. This is Kelly in the red sweater. She's the one that has started the Early Childhood Development Center. And behind her is Doug. He works for a nonprofit organization that actually does consulting to other nonprofits and government. So he has worked in local government in a couple different cities, and he is here in Chicago, currently working at the mayor's office here. But his consulting firm is itself a nonprofit organization, and that is one of the areas where there's been a little bit of confusion. So because his consulting firm is itself a nonprofit, then he obviously qualifies. But there are we've had lots of interest from people who work for consulting companies who are for-profit consulting companies, and they consult to the nonprofit sector. So people in those companies would not be eligible to apply. But it's, you know, it's something that's really kind of interesting to have a consultant who, you know, is working with different governments and other organizations as part of the MBA program. And, you know, when you think about two people like this who have really drastically different career paths ahead of them, it really is, it shows the idea of how really open we are, and the reality that the skill set that you have from an MBA is applicable really quite broadly. So Doug might be, you know, working with local or national governments over the course of his career, working on streamlining and efficiency of processes, or strategic planning, or you know, thinking through different ways of bigger impact. So, you know, the impact he's going to make might look very different than the impact for like an organization like Kelly's, who is very intentionally focused on a small geographic area. So this really is something that we hope that people from across the spectrum think about as, you know, a way of improving skills and increasing impact in organizations, both big and small. The extracurricular kind of activity that for the moment we're kind of focused on lunch roundtables, discussions with leaders in the field. For any of you who know Chicago well, there's the Chicago Community Trust, which is a really important organization here in town to Terry Mazzani. He's the CEO there and executive director. So, for instance, he's somebody that we have lunch with, that he is helping, doing a little one-on-one with some of the civic scholars to help them think through particular issues at their organizations. There's also other folks who, Eric Weinheimer, for instance, he's the head of an organization called Forefront, used to be called Foundation Forum, and he's a Booth grad. He has his MBA, and he's the kind of person as well who, we have lunch with him, we meet with him and talk about that reality of how is it that those MBA skills are genuinely applied in different kinds of nonprofits. So he ran an organization for 17, 18 years that worked specifically with job training and for people who were difficult to employ. So he himself has run this, basically started up and ran a big successful organization for many years, and he's really clear about how important the MBA skills have been for him to be able to have more and more impact in what he's doing. I think I've probably given you the basics. I'm happy to open it up for questions if anybody has questions about any of the details or the application process, or if you want to know more about our 8 Civic Scholars that we currently have.
Sure. We've got some great questions here. In terms of eligibility, could you please talk about the minimum GPA required and the minimum Gmat score?
Sure. So keep in mind that basically the step 1 of becoming a Civic Scholar is that you have to get accepted to Booth. So Civic Scholars will go through the basic admission process like everybody else for the weekend MBA program. So we expect the Civic Scholars to, sort of be in the same academic realm and quality as the rest of our weekend MBA students. So although we say, I think we say something like, we imagine like a 3.5 GPA and about a 700 Gmat, those are definitely not set in stone criteria. That's kind of like, this is who we imagine is likely to be in our applicant pool. But if your GPA is lower than that, if your Gmat score is lower than that, if your years of work experience are higher or lower than kind of their sort of broad definition, that is all completely okay. Our main thing, like anybody else that's getting admitted to Booth, is we want to make sure that people will be academically successful. So but we also totally understand that some of us in undergrad didn't, maybe we didn't have the best GPA, but there's opportunities within the application process to talk about some of that. Maybe there was a situation with your family that made a semester particularly difficult or something like that, and so we are completely open to Gmat scores and GPAs, undergraduate GPAs that are not exactly at that point. But again, the reality is for the Civic Scholars, you first have to get admitted to Booth before we can look at you as a candidate for Civic Scholars. So basically assume it's the same criteria there.
Great, that's very useful. Can you speak to your inaugural class of Civic Scholars, i.e. we've got a lot of questions. The screen just popped up around. Okay, excuse me. Their backgrounds in terms of perhaps how many years experience they came with, and is it a sort of a balance between government and nonprofits?
Yeah, I love our inaugural class. They're just great. So background-wise, there's lots of different undergraduate degrees that they have. 4 of the 8 of them already have at least one other graduate degree, but their own academic backgrounds range from one person who has a fine arts degree and minor in Hindi language, to people who did political science, environmental studies, biochemistry. So they really kind of range. Political science, I don't think any of them have any kind of what you would think of as a typical business academic background. So nobody was a econ or statistics or business major. So that's one of the things that I think is great, that you know, really, whatever your background is, it's just as likely that you're going to be able to get into the program as somebody else. This group ranges with years of experience from, I think, 5 to about 12. But that's another area where that's not, you know, sort of that range is not set in stone. So if you don't have, I think we put 6 to 13, something like that, on our material. If you don't have 6, you know, if you have a little less than that, that's fine. If you have more than 13, that's fine. The way that we think about that in particular is, you know, you're going to spend 3 years getting the MBA, and then you have, you know, the rest of your career to use that to help increase your impact. So we don't necessarily want somebody who's just in their very first job with a year or 2 out, partly because a little more experience than that can help you think about how, you know, these skill sets are applicable. But we also, you know, hope somebody has lots of years left to apply what they're learning. So if you're kind of on the verge of retirement, this probably isn't the right place for you either. But you know, the reality is, you know, a lot of us are going to work till we're 70 years old, and so, you know, even if you have 10 or 15 years of experience, you have a whole lot more years left to use this skill set and apply it in the field. What was the other question about that, related to that?
I think
you
covered it, but there was another follow-up. Can you speak to the number of applicants? I know last year was your inaugural year, but how many applicants you actually had? And is it the selection process, is it a collaborative selection process between Booth and the Neubauer Family Foundation?
Oh yeah, I remember what the other part of the previous question was. So again, sort of our applicant pool from that first round, I wouldn't assume is going to be what is typical. For instance, we had a lot more people from the Chicago area apply than we hope will be the case going forward. We hope that we'll have a lot more people from across the country applying as well. So our current class is Chicago heavy. It's 6 people from Chicago, 1 from New York, 1 from Seattle. I anticipate, you know, like I said, going forward, just that pool of applicants from places outside of Chicago will increase. But we don't have any sort of, we want to make sure there's, you know, 4 Chicago and 4 outside Chicago. So we don't have any specific targets, so to speak, on those. So we're open to, you know, our best candidates who we think are going to add the most value to the program and carry this forward is who we're going to choose. So we don't have any you know, targets on anything like that. We did have we had 66 applications in that first round, but like I said, it was only open for about 4 months. I anticipate that we will have many more than that this year. I have had requests for information from people who've reached out and, you know, wanted more info about the program. I've had over 600 so far this year. So I think that the reality of translating somebody requesting information into an actual application, we don't know what that's going to look like yet. But I would anticipate that we would have at least 66, if not more, applicants in the pool this coming year. So the selection process is one where, like I mentioned, the basic admissions to booth is just like everybody else. So our admissions team handles that part. So once they've said to us, okay, here's all the people who we will offer admission to booth to, then we will take that pool of people who are applying for Civic Scholars. And then there are several of us that will go through those applications, read all those applications. So it's myself and then a couple of the assistant and associate deans. And then we will take that, we'll take that pool, we'll narrow it down to a smaller group, probably 15 or 16. And then those 15 or 16 we will invite back for another round of interviews. And the interviews, again, it will be with me and a couple of the assistant and associate deans and the Christina Hachikian, who runs the Social Enterprise Initiative. So we'll do second round interviews with that group, and then from there we'll choose the actual 8 Civic Scholars. So there's kind of multiple levels and layers of people, but there's a lot of eyes looking at each of the applications and coming to the decision.
Great. I think you answered it, but you're looking for a diverse group, not, even though you had a huge number of people, or percentage-wise, of applicants from Illinois, you're looking for people from all over the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we talk about wanting a diverse group, it's geographically diverse, but the nonprofit sector obviously is a giant thing, just like the private sector. So we hope that we'll have a broad spectrum of the kinds of organizations or levels of government that people work in. So our current 8 Civic Scholars, it happens that 2 of them work for environmental organizations, but there was no, we don't have anything like, we want to make sure there's one person from education and one person from public policy and one person from health or anything like that. So we don't have kind of a rubric, so to speak, of that, but we do hope that our applicant pool is one that is really diverse, so that the likelihood of the candidates who end up getting chosen are equally as diverse. Like right now, I'm doing this from a hotel room in Houston, because I was down here last night talking to prospective applicants who are several of them in a couple different kinds of organizations here. Last week I was in Seattle and San Francisco and San Jose, again talking with folks, prospects from different organizations there. I'll be going to Atlanta later this week, going to Milwaukee and St. Louis and Indianapolis. So we're trying to, just like our recruiters who recruit for our the general pool, I'm trying to get out and talk to people and give people more information about the program all across the country, so people start thinking about it. And we know that a lot of people, if you haven't been thinking about an MBA yet anyway, and you first hear about this, it might be a year or 2 before you kind of think through it, decide if it's the right thing for you, do the application process and all of that. So, I think a lot of the work that we did over the last year and over the next couple of years are really going to be helping lay the foundation for, more and more people knowing that this is out there, thinking about it. And I think that we have a slightly different challenge than the regular, MBA pool in that, like I said, many people in the nonprofit sector haven't thought about getting an MBA. And so step one is getting people to think about it and think about whether it's a skill set that they think is going to be valuable to them and their organizations, or how they impact their communities. And then step two, getting people to actually think about and going through that process of applying. So in the first round, we had some people who applied who had already been thinking about an MBA, but we had a whole lot of people apply who literally heard about Civic Scholars Program in February and never thought about getting an MBA, never thought about Booth, had never heard of Chicago Booth, and went through the application process. And so I think that we're going to have a little bit more of a mixed bag than some of the kind of the typical applicant pools that are not Civic Scholars, just because I think it's new in a lot of ways to many people. And if you're out there in general talking to people who are thinking about business school, they probably know the name Chicago Booth. If you are out there, I sort of randomly pick something, if you're at a small museum in Tucson, Arizona, and you've never thought about business school and you don't know anybody who went to, Chicago undergrad or anything like that, Booth may have zero brand recognition for you. So, there's the MBA in general, and then there's the Chicago Booth as a specific place and what the Chicago approach means and all of those sorts of things. So I think for the population that we're aiming for, there isn't that automatic recognition necessarily.
Great. Sorry, I had to unmute myself. There are a lot of questions about dates. The deadline for applying for the Civics Scholars Program, the deadline for applying for the weekend MBA, and Gmat, all that sort of thing.
So the Civic Scholars Program, when you apply for the Civic Scholars Program, you actually use the weekend MBA application. So what happens is when you start your weekend MBA application, you will indicate that you are also applying for Civic Scholars, and it will auto-populate an additional essay that's specific to Civic Scholars. So it is the exact same application as anybody else applying for weekend MBA, except you'll have one additional essay on the Civic Scholars front. And the essay is more or less, why should we give you the scholarship instead of somebody else? And so that's again, it's as straightforward as the regular weekend MBA application. The due date, however, is April 21st, which is a little bit earlier than the non-Civic Scholars weekend application. That application is due in May. I can't remember the exact date. And so because for Civic Scholars it's more of a multi-step process, we are having those applications due a little bit earlier, so that we can get through those as well as the non-Civic Scholars weekend applications kind of in a timely manner. And then Civic Scholars will always start in September, so the group that is chosen each year will start together in September. So even though for the weekend MBA, we have in general 2 times a year that you could start the program, for Civic Scholars it's only going to be September. So for your, we take the GRE as well, so you can take either the Gmat or the GRE, and you essentially have to, we have to have your score with your application. Now, you can, if you take the exam, you can self-report the score, and then we will verify it. If you're going to be admitted, if we think you're going to be admitted, we will verify it. But you can take it anytime you want. And I believe, because they're mostly electronic now, that it's nearly automatic that, if you say that to send the scores to us, that it will happen, in a short period of time. You also, we don't look unfavorably on applications where somebody maybe took the GMAT or GRE more than once. So if you take it and you're not happy with your score, take it again. If you think that that you can do better a second time. So if anything, we look at that and think, oh, all right, well, this person really worked hard and to improve their score, and that looks maybe better than if. So we don't think negatively in any way if you take the exam more than once to get a better score.
Right, and one more logistic question before we go on to questions about the Civic Scholars that you've got in at Booth right now. How long can you take to complete your weekend MBA? Because people are working full-time, they might have more time or less time.
Right. Actually, that is one of the great advantages of Booth, from what I've learned compared to other programs around the country. So at Booth, you have up to 5 years to complete your MBA. So most students take 2 classes a quarter, and we have classes all 4 quarters. So if you do that consistently, you're done in 2.5 years. But there's a lot of people who, if you have kids, maybe you want to take the summer quarter off so you can do family vacation, or if you know there's going to be a certain part of the year where it's just completely insane at work, maybe it's production season if you're at a ballet or something like that. So you can choose to take only 1 course a quarter. You could choose to take a quarter off. So there isn't really any kind of lockstep, you have to do it in this order, in this time. You have up to 5 years. And so that's, so any of those general weekend MBA parameters are the same for the Civic Scholars. So people can, they can do it as quickly as they want, or they can, take 4 or 5 years if they need to.
That's great, very generous. I love this question.
We understand that life happens. So, it's like you're working full time, you're trying to go to school, and then there's those things like parents and kids, and, people get married and people have babies and all those sorts of things. So we understand that life happens, and so we try to make that really quite reasonable for you to stay on track.
Great. Yeah, as I was saying, I love this question. What MBA skills are your current Civic Scholar students finding the most enlightening, perhaps surprising?
Well, given that they've only had 1.5 quarters of classes, I'm not sure that I have a lot of info about that. A year from now, check back. But several of them have commented that sort of generally, they are thinking differently about some of the problems at work, that they're doing a little bit deeper analysis on them. One of the things about Booth is that we're very much about data-driven decision-making. And so several of them have talked about, how they just have realized that they've started approaching issues at work from a slightly different lens. I think several of them are taking financial accounting this quarter. So ask me next quarter if that if that has been being applied. But there's also a course. There's a course, one's called what is it called? Managerial decision modeling and managerial decision making, and a couple of them are taking one or other of those, and so I think that will be really interesting at the end of this quarter to see, sort of how they think about management and general management and those sorts of things at their work. But they have all been really excited about the coursework. They're doing fine. Their grades are good, but they've been really excited about being in an environment where there's just really great discussion, people challenging each other about their ideas, people being real collaborative in figuring out how to approach problems. And so they're all very excited about it and they're loving it. But I can't say that I have any. I don't have sufficient data yet to to talk about really what changes have happened.
Great. Then we'll have to invite you to speak about this next year.
Yes. Check back in a year from now.
We will. On the Booth Weekend Admissions website, I see that you need 2 letters of recommendation, but they don't see the prompt on, I guess, on how to attach them, perhaps?
So the letters of recommendation, actually, I think I may have to amend this statement afterwards. I think what happens is that you send a link to the person who is going to do the letter of recommendation. You send a link to them, and they send it in directly. That you don't attach it to your application. That person sends it in directly. We do ask you on the application to check whether you waive your right to see the letter before it's submitted or after it's submitted. So you need to do that, but when you'll give their information and their email address and such. And so I can't remember if it's auto-generated that it goes to them, telling them that you've requested a letter of recommendation, or if it's something that you send them the link. But either way, it is not that you upload it for them. They send it directly to us.
Sounds about right, because I know for the law school, that's what they required. They if you're applying to law school, you send a link to the person, and then on that, you tell them, hey, I'm sending you this link for a letter. So that's great. Okay, good. What's next? Again, they're only 1.5 quarters into their studies, but have they started any projects that you're aware of?
Not that I know of. There will a couple of them who have taken a class or two together have been part of together group projects in those courses. But outside of that, I can't think of anything. I don't think any of them have, started thinking about starting another nonprofit or anything like that.
Okay, great. Okay, this is a question just in general about the weekend MBA. Since they only get together 1 day a week, what kind of networking do you find that weekend MBA students are doing with each other?
It is amazing when you think about the fact that people are working all week and they flying into Chicago or driving into Chicago for 1 day a week. It is amazing how much networking they do. So to begin with, there's over 40 student clubs that are specific for evening and weekend students. So there's a lot of student clubs that meet on Saturdays. The Civic scholars themselves, we're doing some of these lunch roundtable discussions to help increase their connections with networks. But in general, because there are a lot of there's a lot of group work in the various classes. They throughout the course of the week, all of the students are connecting with each other through their group, with the group work and class. So there's a lot of opportunity to actually stay connected to people during the week, and it's for some people they really do want to come in, take their classes, and leave, and they aren't engaging in a lot outside of that. But for most of the students, they're part of student clubs. They help organize other events. And the student clubs are everything from, the running club and the beer club to marketing club or investment club. So there's everything that is, both kind of career related and completely social. So there are just a lot of opportunities, even if it's, if the reality is you're around for 12 hours on a Saturday, there's still lots of opportunity to connect with other folks.
Great. We've got another application essay question, or perhaps this is the first one, I don't remember at this point. Would you prefer that the application essay focuses more on nonprofit goals, like the goals that you have, or is it more on why an MBA, why you're looking for an MBA?
Well, there's a couple different essays. So there's kind of a couple different there's different places where you will answer sort of both of those. I will say this is that we really want to genuinely see you and who you are and what you're thinking. Since we don't really have a typical student in mind. We know everybody's going to have different kinds of goals when you think about either your own career or organization or those sorts of things. And so you might be thinking about an MBA because it's something that you think will make you a better leader of any organization, or you might be thinking about an MBA because you can see how in your current organization you could very specifically create more impact. So, I have to say, in general, with the essays on the applications for weekend, whether it's Civic Scholars or not, we want you to just think about them and answer them how it feels right for you. There isn't kind of we don't have a list of did they say these 6 words and check them off to make sure you've hit high points, but we genuinely want to know like who you are and what you're thinking about and where you think any of this is going to take you. I know that's kind of vague, but we don't, when it comes to the essays, it is, it's something that everybody's going to answer them differently, and we don't have sort of a specific kind of essay that we want.
Great. One last question before we go that we're going to take, and I have to say, Molly, for somebody who's got a sore throat, you've done a phenomenal job taking all these questions and giving us so much good information. So the last one is, what are the midweek time expectations for those who are working and traveling, who are already working 40 hours a week?
So, people who are doing, I'm not exactly sure what the question is asking.
Yeah, I think it's how many hours do you think during the week are people spending on their courses in addition to the actual being in the classroom?
Right.
I think that's what it's being.
Okay. Well, actually, that is, it's amazing that Booth has this, but being the data-driven world that it is, it isn't all that surprising. So each class, when you're looking at the different classes to register, there is information about every class and every professor from the student, end of class reviews. So every class and every professor will have information about how much time is average for students to spend outside of the classroom on homework experience, how good was the professor, what were kind of the highlights or the aspects of the way the class was taught, or things like that. So you can see for every class what kind of the typical amount of work is you're going to need to do each week. So, and those are going to vary. There are going to be some classes where, maybe it's 5 or 6 hours, but there's going to be other classes where, it's 15 or 20. So I think that the kind of strategy on thinking about coursework is, if there is going to be a class that's just going to be a ton of work outside of the classroom during the week, that maybe you think you'll only take one class that quarter. Or you balance one that's going to have a lot of work with another one that's not going to have quite as much work. So you really, that one of the greatest things about Booth, beyond, the great faculty and students, is that you really get to design, your program as you like it. So you have to take 20 courses. 6 of them can actually be outside of Booth. So you could take a class at the Harris School of Public Policy, or in the School of Social Work. So you can add in the parts of the curriculum that, if Booth doesn't have it and another school does, you can bring that in to help make the degree what you want it to be. So you really can try to balance out the reality of your life and work schedule with the reality of the different classes and how much time it takes. But, I would say you should assume, at least 5 or 6 hours a week outside of class that you're gonna do for each course. And then, because there are a lot of there's a lot of group work, and people are in all different time zones, most of the time the students will just say, okay, every Tuesday night at 7 o'clock, we're all going to get on a Skype call together. And they just, they set up those at the very beginning of the quarter. They keep it as a standing meeting, and they just, they keep it all worked into their schedule. So from the outside, it all looks very overwhelming, I think. But the reality is, it just becomes what you're used to. You become efficient at what you're doing, and so that you get it all in, you become a master at time management. And the students are all supportive of each other. So, students will know that maybe one person, it's a tough week at work, and they're not going to be able to contribute quite as much as somebody else in the group. And so, people help each other out. So it's really, it's rigorous and it's hard, but it's a really supportive environment where, everybody that's there, the faculty, the staff, we're there to make sure people succeed. So it's really an environment where the students are very collaborative, and there's a kind of a support system to help people figure out how to make life and work and school all function together.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for your questions. These webinars would not be as great without your input, and we can't think of everything, so your questions are really important to us. A special thank you to Molly for this informative and, I thought, fun presentation. As a reminder, please watch for your email next week for a link to the recording. So if you missed anything, you'll catch it on the recording. And we have a very short survey. It's basically, was the speaker knowledgeable about the content? Would you recommend these types of webinars to friends of alumni? And we invite you to join us online at careers.uchicagoalumni.org, where you'll find upcoming events, webinar archives, our jobs board, and a forum to let us know if you've hired a U Chicago graduate at your organization, because we'd like to give you a little gift if you've done so. I hope that you enjoy the remainder of your day, and thank you again, everyone. Bye.
Thank you all.